and consultant, trained at the University of Kansas, earning a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering in 1978 and a Master of Science in Water Resources Engineering in 1991. Upon graduation, David worked for 3 years in consulting in Minnesota and 3 years as a water resources engineer in a developing nation of Southern Africa. David spent most of his career working for Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources, starting in 1984. In 2007, David was appointed chief engineer. In this capacity, David directed the staff of the division in fulfilling their broad responsibility over the state's water resources, including administration of 4 interstate water compacts, more than 30,000 active water rights, and the safety of thousands of dams and other water structures. David's accomplishments as chief engineer included supporting passage and implementation of legislative initiatives to extend the useful life of the Ogallala Aquifer, leading Kansas' effort to protect Kansas entitlements under the Republican River Compact, negotiating agreements with Colorado implementing the U.S. Supreme Court's final decree on the Arkansas River, and negotiating the state first tribal water rights settlement, and many more activities that he oversees, basically. David retired from state service on March 1st, 2020, and during June 2020, began working as a consultant, specializing in water rights matters and assisting groundwater management districts in implementing enhanced water management. So with that, let's welcome Mr. Barfield to our class today. And we are looking forward to hear your talk, David.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Rahmani, and for inviting me again. I think I did it last year, and it was a very enjoyable experience. And so I'm going to focus on basically 2 things in this talk, sort of providing an overview of our Kansas system of water rights, and why we have it, why it's necessary, and the basic attributes and features of our water rights system. And then talk about its application to shortages and conflicts, sort of some of the current issues that we're facing in our state that illustrate sort of how the system works or isn't working. So basically, I'll give, like I said, an overview of the basics. At the end of the basics on the Kansas water law, I'll stop. That'll be about 20 minutes in roughly. And just provide an opportunity for questions about the first part of the lecture. Then I'll go on and talk about sort of current day real world applications of the water rights systems, especially where it touches conflicts. Water is a scarce resource, and so we have conflicts. And I'll illustrate that in a couple significant ways on current issues. At the end of the Quivira impairment, I'll stop again and see if you have questions on it. And then the last part of the lecture will look specifically at the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer, the declines that have been occurring over the decades, and what we're doing about that large issue. So this is a Landsat composite that I think kind of illustrates in just one picture a lot of the diversity that we see in Kansas with respect to our water resources. Obviously, we go from you see a lot of green in the east. The east part of the state is dominated, very little groundwater resources, but fairly significant stream flows, at least most of the time, that sort of drive the hydrologic cycle and produce the lush green that you tend to see in the eastern part of our state. As we move west, we become more arid to semi-arid. So a lot of brown dominates the western part of the state, and then we go from one to the other. So did we lose our? Anyway, are you still seeing my screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. I'm actually seeing a little window of you now. So
yes, I wanted to. Yes. So you're seeing the screen.
A couple other features, you'll notice green in parts of western Kansas, especially south central Kansas, southwestern Kansas. That's obviously driven by irrigation from our Ogallala High Plains Aquifer. There actually is a fair amount of irrigation from the Ogallala in western Kansas, central western, and northwestern. And we're going to be talking about those areas. Obviously, excuse me, I'll go back. Not to the same extent as Southwest, but it's a very significant part of their economy there. The other thing that you see dotting the map are our system of federal reservoirs. Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation have reservoirs in especially eastern part of the state. So again, the key descriptor that I use when I describe our water resources is variability. Again, eastern Kansas, this is mean stream flows. Obviously, a lot of stream flow in Missouri and Kansas River, especially in eastern Kansas, much less so as you move west. Stream flow is great if you had the mean daily values occurring constantly, that would be good, but obviously it's subject to persistent drought, and so that's one of the reasons we have our system of reservoirs. And then groundwater is depicted by the major aquifers. Not all of them are equally productive. The most productive aquifer of Kansas is the Ogallala High Plains of western Kansas and south central Kansas. And again, that'll be the focus of our discussion at the end of this lecture. Again, both prone to shortages and conflicts, and that's why we need a system to divide up the water, to regulate its development, and to deal with disputes. So we have a lot of water laws in Kansas. I've just listed a few of the major ones here. The overarching or foundational act of our water right system, of our system that regulates water use, is the Kansas Water Appropriation Act. It was passed in 1945, and I'll talk about it in particular. In 1973, the legislature added the Groundwater Management District Act that gave local boards and districts a voice in how the appropriation acts in their groundwater systems. The chief engineer under the Appropriation Act still does all the approvals, but they have a role in guiding that. And we have a number of acts that basically allowed the state of Kansas to purchase federal storage in those reservoirs and to market it for various purposes, and through the Assurance Program Act to operate them as a system to optimize the benefits of those reservoirs where multiple reservoirs occur in a single basin. So Kansas has a lot of different agencies that are involved in the water world, and I just want you to be aware in case you ever get involved in it. That's true nationally as well, and all states have a lot of different players in the water game. We probably have more than many because we sort of have diverse functions. So I was chief engineer of the Division of Water Resources. That's part of the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Again, it administers that foundational Kansas Water Appropriation Act as its principal duty. It also it represents the state. The chief engineer represents the state on our interstate compacts. We won't talk about that in this lecture. And also regulates when people want to build something in a floodplain or stream channel, the division also regulates that. Within the Department of Ag, there's also a division of conservation, and that division funds a lot of the water projects, sort of the on-the-ground projects. The Kansas Water Office is also a sister state agency to the Division of Water Resources. Its principal duties is the Kansas State Water Plan. We have a proactive approach of always kind of looking at our water laws and policies and how can we continue to innovate to serve state citizens. There's also the State Water Plan Fund, so offices over those. And then the Water Office is actually the entity that does the contracting with federal reservoir space. Department of Health and Environment regulates water quality. Then we have our local districts, such as groundwater management districts, as well as federal partners. This system's been in place, and about every decade or so, the legislature says, we should put all these entities, the state entities, into one agency, like a Department of Natural Resources, but it has not done so to date. We have the state water planning process, though, that sort of helps us keep organized and coordinated. And I think the system's working pretty well overall. So, all right, so let's go on to the Appropriation Act. Again, this foundational act, it moved us, the state, to what's called the Water Appropriation Doctrine, as opposed to the riparian doctrine that's used in the eastern part of the U.S., where basically, so that act, all water within the state is dedicated to the use of people of the state, subject to the regulation in the manner prescribed by the act. So water is a public resource, but it can be appropriated for public or private use under this act. It's based on prior appropriation, what basically is first in time, first in right. So when there's a shortage of water, the more senior water right, the first water right is protected from subsequent development and interference by a junior water right. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Kansas is somewhat unique in the West. We have groundwater and surface water in a single statutory priority system. Many states have separate statutes for dealing with surface water and groundwater. I think we're fortunate to have it in the single system because there are times they're related and have to be managed conjunctively, and it facilitates that. And again, we'll have an illustration of that here when we talk about Quivira. So the chief engineer basically allocates the water supply. He determines whether new water rights can be approved and under what conditions and when they can no longer be approved. Most of the entire western part of the state and much of central part of the state has been closed to new appropriations because they're already fully developed or orderly developed. And then the regulation or administration of those water rights in times of shortage. Again, in surface water systems, this priority administration is routine and fairly straightforward. In groundwater, these conflicts are much more complicated because they're not linear systems. So again, the chief engineer's charge, is to oversee this, determine what's called vested rights, pre-1945 rights, develop rules to effectuate the law, approve new applications and changes in water rights. So that the act allows water rights to be changed, which is obviously necessary. A water right owner, and we'll talk about this as well, can change their point of diversion, their place of use, and or their use made of water. And as much of the state is closed to new appropriations, if we have expanding cities need more water or new industries or new uses, typically what they do is they purchase water rights from an existing water right holder, most often irrigation, and then they convert it to a new use. But and then so the act has a pretty comprehensive ability for the chief engineer to require water use reporting and metering, which is required and allows us to have accurate data, but also allows the chief engineer to make sure that people are complying with their permits. Regulate unlawful use. The division has a section that basically makes sure people are complying and not overusing their water rights in dealing with that. And then protect storage releases. So tools to carry out unambiguous authority, the ability to develop rules, staff and field offices, fees, enforcement, and if needed, and we've done this, assistance from the Attorney General in enforcing the act. So the act was principally, and when it was passed in 1945, was sort of a development framework and was there basically to encourage the development of the resource, to put it to that resource, whether it be groundwater, surface water, to economic use. And water rights in the early period prior to 1978 were not required to use water, but people filed for them because they wanted that high priority in case there was a time of shortage. So in the late 1940s, and especially 50s and 60s, irrigation began to rapidly expand with pump technologies and something called a center pivot that allows you to to use water on an irrigated field without leveling it. Opened up vast areas to new appropriations. So this is a graphic that just shows you the increase in the number of water rights, the amount appropriated over time, and just how that sort of exploded in the 70s. And then as we closed areas to new appropriations, starting in 1978, we had the ability to require water rights and close areas. And so the development has sort of stabilized some since then. This is a depiction of sort of where water is used and what it's used for. The size of the circle depicts the average use from that county. The colors of the pie man charts, as we call them, show what the water is used for. So obviously irrigation is the blue and dominates the west and parts of the central. Municipal use is in that sort of orangey color, and then industrial use is in the yellow. So the municipal uses and industrial uses are obviously more dominant in the more populous south central and eastern Kansas. So this is a depiction of the western Kansas of this Ogallala High Plains aquifer, and I'll come back to that in a minute. This is showing groundwater declines. So this area is overappropriated, and we have problems out there. All this development also produced, this is a stream flow hydrograph in Kinsley, Kansas, south central Kansas. We have a lot of reductions in stream flows that have occurred as we've allowed water development to occur adjacent to the stream systems. So basically, you've had to innovate our law in a number of major ways. That foundational law has remained there. Again, in 72, we added the GMD Act. In 78, the legislature moved to require water rights for all non-domestic uses, and also added new tools, new groundwater tools that I'll talk about in a minute. The state implemented, based on the additional regulatory authority, a lot of new restrictions on water rights, closing areas, using a principle called safe yield to guide new development. The legislature mandated minimum desirable stream flows in many of the streams of eastern Kansas and central Kansas. And so all water rights after 1984 have been conditioned on certain stream flows occurring before they can actually operate. So in periods of low stream flows, we actually regulate water rights that were put in place after 1984 based on those requirements. Water use reporting was improved, and penalties are now allowed and enforced. And the division implemented significant regulations. And then some of the new tools I'll talk about as we go through here. So again, this is a sort of a composite of all the special areas. The pink streams are basically ones that are regulated, either closed or regulated by MDS. Anyway, we have a fairly complex system of rules in place. Each sort of basin is regulated a bit differently. And again, this is that system of federal reservoirs that I spoke about. Actually, here we go. Okay, so the current situation here, I'll pause here in a moment for questions on the basic of our water law. That's, I'll see it applied here in a minute, but so other than the Ogallala High Plains system that is highly overdeveloped, most of the state is, in my view, and I think most share this, fairly well managed under the Appropriation Act as in its principles of priority. You know, when the whole system is sort of considered, both the Appropriation Act and the reservoir system and all the supplemental acts, we feel like we have a pretty good system that works well outside the Ogallala High Plains. Most of our innovation in our laws in my tenure as chief engineer the last 12 years were really designed to help us in the Ogallala High Plains system. We have very good water use data in Kansas, much better than most neighboring states, and we've had that in place now for 3 decades. As a result of that, we have we're building some very robust groundwater models that again are helping us in our water management decisions. And again, through the water plan process, we continue to find ways to continue to innovate. Again, our principal challenges are reservoir sedimentation. I won't be speaking about that, but obviously the reservoir system is very important to central and eastern Kansas, and at varying rates are filling up with sediment, and the water office is sort of the lead in terms of trying to figure out how to address that particular problem. They've done a dredging project in John Redmond Lake that was very expensive, but it was an attempt to see if that was a viable solution. They're now working with the Corps of Engineers and others to figure out if there's a way to, instead of having the reservoir sediment build up in the reservoir, is there a way as the water comes through is to bring more of that sediment through to reduce the rate of sedimentation in the reservoir. And the other big challenge, again, is the Ogallala High Plains management and the increasing conflicts that come from, as those waters diminish, we have more and more conflicts for what remains. So any questions on the basics of our water rights?
Great. Any questions? So I had a question here. So how is the water basically being managed in Kansas? Is it, especially groundwater, is it based on watershed boundaries? Is it based on the groundwater districts? And then how are the conflicts basically, if it's based on districts, then when we pass the boundary, who is responsible for downstream impacts?
Well, so the chief engineer is charged with the administration of the act. So all the water rights and the regulations of water rights are done by the chief engineer and the Division of Water Resources. Groundwater management districts are there to guide. So there's the basic water law, and then there's the ability to develop implementing regulations. So the GMDs, the groundwater management districts, they recommend rules and regulations for the chief engineer to adopt on their behalf. And so each of the GMDs has a body of regulations adopted by the chief engineer and administered by the chief engineer still. It basically sets out how much water they would allow to be appropriated. So each GMDs has a bit different rules about new development, spacing of water rights and those sorts of things. So again, the GMD's recommended rules that the chief engineer adopted that allowed for development. As conflict occurs, the next section deals with what we call impairment investigations and how those are conducted by the chief engineer. But again, it's done by the chief engineer. He determines when junior water rights are interfering with senior water rights and then does the regulations.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other question? Nothing for now, seems like.
All right, let me keep going then. And I think these illustrations will help as well. So again, as I spoke about water rights, people change water rights. Again, often they're changed for new uses, but one of the big changes that happens in the Ogallala is, typical irrigation well lasts maybe 25 years or so. And to a certain extent, water users, they'll need to replace a well, and maybe the area they're at is sort of running out of water. And so they're going to want to file a change in point of diversion to drill a new well up to half a mile away. And they'll typically want to try and move to a little sweeter spot. The trouble with all that is there's a fairly dense development in parts of Southwest Kansas. So when you're moving closer to somebody else, and then that person then will object, and so over the last decade, we've had increasing conflicts and had to develop new methods to make sure that people can only move when they're not going to interfere with other water rights. So the city of Hayes in northwest Kansas is not in a good spot for water. And so they've been looking for decades for where to go for more water. They're not in the Ogallala High Plains. Should they develop a pipeline and take water from further west or south? There's some federal reservoirs around. Should they go to the federal reservoirs? What should they do? In 1995, after this long search, they purchased a set of water rights on what's called the R9 Ranch near Kinsley. This sort of shows a depiction of the red are the existing irrigation rights. The green are the consolidated proposed municipal rights. They purchased the ranch. They've been operating it as a ranch, and a few years ago here, they initiated changing those water rights from irrigation use to municipal use. And the challenge here is that they're going 80 miles away. And so those changes have to be approved under the Appropriation Act. And then they're also subject to a Water Transfer Act that regulates use, these transfers of certain quantities of water over certain distances. So 2 approvals are required. The city initiated the changes in 2015. In 2019, in March, after a very extensive process, lots of public input, the locals don't like their water, what they consider their water, moving out of their area. But after considering all that and ensuring that the amount of water to be moved was protecting the local resource, that approval was done. This decision is under judicial review. So if somebody isn't happy, then they can take this to the courts. And so that's what's been done. That process is just now sort of wrapping up. I'm fairly confident that the change approvals will be upheld, and then we'll have the water transfer proceeding that will consider the matter more fully. Basically, it has the Transfer Act, the change approvals that were approved in 2019 were done just like every other water right, essentially in the same body of rules and the same sort of decisions. The Water Transfer Act sort of does this weighing of the benefits of to the donor basin and the recipient, where it's coming from and where it's going to make sure things are done well. So I want to move to this impairment question that you were asking about. So again, a fundamental charge of the chief engineer under the act is to protect senior uses from being impaired by junior uses. The act prohibits any person with a junior appropriation from preventing a senior appropriator from having the water, and charges the chief engineer to make sure that doesn't happen. So these sorts of actions of surface water systems are pretty routine, where we'll have a senior water right that's being interfered with by a junior upstream, and we just shut off the junior upstream as long as the senior needs it. We actually sort of just use the term water administration for that sorts of activities. But we're getting more and more, as the Ogallala declines, more and more conflicts in groundwater systems where a groundwater user is alleging that a nearby junior water right is interfering with them. And these matters are complex to investigate. You've got to look at the system and the wells and make sure there really is a true connection and make sure that your regulation of the junior will in fact benefit the senior. But we're doing those and sort of working through those. The big impairment issue we've got going on in our state right now is related to the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. So if you can see my cursor here at the bottom of this, so this is the Rattlesnake Basin in south central Kansas. This gray area at the bottom of the basin is the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. It has a very senior water right on the river, obviously a surface water right. They divert the flows of the rattlesnake that goes through the refuge. So they're a surface water user. But this groundwater development upstream, these are all, the red dots are junior groundwater rights, junior to Quivira. And they are connected hydrologically to the surface system. As they pump, part of the water is from the surface system. So there's been so declining stream flows and a complaint by the service for decades. This is the surface geology. It's all sandy soils out there. So the groundwater, I mean the surface water rainfall seeps in this groundwater system and then finds its way to this rattlesnake system. This is just a depiction from the model about how much that junior groundwater pumping is taking from stream flow over time. It continues to increase. This is a depiction of the impairment investigation and the amount of impairment we found by year. So we've been searching for the last several years since completing the investigation and finding that those junior users, something on the order of 1,400 wells, are interfering with Quivira. What do we do about it? The local groundwater management districts wants to build an augmentation project. There's an area that's not too far away that's not connected to the system hydrologically where they could pump water and augment the stream to prevent the impairment. Then the other option is long-term pumping reductions. You pump less, you interfere less. And we have different ways to accomplish that or a combination. I'm going to skip this just with time here. So so basically this continues to develop. The division is open to the idea of augmentation. It has its challenges. And so the division maintains that a modest decrease in stream flow, about 15%, needs to occur in addition to an augmentation project. The local GMD has not been agreeable to that. And so basically in October of last year, I moved to implement the reduction. The augmentation project has not been built and they're moving very slowly about it. So in October of last year, without them acting, I moved to initiate orders to implement the 15% reduction. As I was doing that, Senator Moran negotiated with the federal, with basically the Department of Interior that oversees the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to give them more time. So that's where we're at now. With the new administration coming in, likely this situation is going to be heating up again. So it generated a lot of emotion, I can tell you. When I went out in October to announce the orders, we had 800 people attend our meetings to explain all that. So I imagine this one's going to heat up again. So,
Wow.
So again, I'm going to go on to talk about the Ogallala as a last subject, but any questions at this point on the last couple topics here?
Any questions? Molly?
How do you handle like applicants that don't have enough water to survive versus
Did you hear that?
No, I didn't hear a word.
So, oh, okay.
No.
So the question was, how do you handle to have enough basically water for people to survive as compared to going after senior, junior rights, right? Is that, yeah. So how do you handle that conflict?
Yeah. Well, really, the water user is in charge of that issue. I mean, if a city, so cities need water. Obviously, cities that are growing need water. I'm actually one of my clients right now is the city of Garden City, which is in southwest Kansas, and obviously is growing. One of the, there's a lot of Western Kansas that it isn't, but Dodge City and Garden City are growing, and so the user of the water, it's their responsibility, I guess, to acquire the water rights necessary. And so the city of Garden City has actually purchased a number of water rights, and I'm actually working with them to sort of figure out what each of those is worth and how it might fit in their system and which ones to develop further. So cities, have to be diligent to pay attention and to develop either new water. Fortunately for us, a lot of the larger cities, a lot of the significant population centers are still in areas that are open to new appropriations, so they have options. But in areas where we're no longer open, then they have to find other water rights and convert them. Same with new industries. If an industry wants to develop, it has to acquire the water rights and change them for their use.
Okay, thanks. So another thing, I think in the slides, Iguca and Lima have been shared a couple of times. I wanted to ask if you could expand on those and explain those a little bit more. We have discussed Lima a little bit here, but we were
Yeah.
waiting for you to expand on that. Thank you.
Yes, and let me go ahead and continue on because that's where we're going next. So.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so the Ogallala is Western Kansas here. The High Plains is a term for the overall aquifer, of which the Ogallala is one unit. Other units of the High Plains is the Great Bend Prairie area. That's Quivira is in this system, and then the Equus beds is used extensively by the city of Wichita. But we have a lot of declines in the Ogallala. What do we do about them? We've known about it for decades. This shows the percentage change in saturated thickness. This is Southwest Kansas, GMD number 3. Western Kansas, GMD number 1 is in the central part. I'll talk about them. And then Northwest Kansas is GMD number 4. So the legislative acts to conserve groundwater include the 72 and 78 acts I've already talked about. Those acts anticipated that, so IGUCAs we'll talk about here in a minute. That was the initial tool the legislature devised to figure out how can we cut back our use through that mechanism. And that mechanism, I'll talk about here in a minute, has been used in 8 situations, none of them in the Ogallala itself, mostly in alluvial systems. So in 2012, this option of local enhanced management areas is allowed. We'll talk about that, and water conservation areas. So here's our GMDs. I've already sort of talked about those GMDs. Their actions was basically to slow and eventually close the areas to new appropriations. So they definitely helped us with that. Helped develop regulations that regulate change applications, metering, groundwater model studies, incentive programs, but no real act to cut back pumping in these overappropriated areas until Lima's. So, but IGUCA's basically is the 1978 mechanism that allowed a groundwater management district or the chief engineer to take action in these overappropriated areas, allowing for more flexible solutions and water right administration, which doesn't work well in groundwater systems. And basically to put in a system of allocations to sort of bring in something closer to balance. It requires formal hearings by the chief engineer because you're regulating essentially a property right, and a decision by the chief engineer based on that hearing record. So this is a map depicting where our IGUCAs are. And again, the only thing, the most significant is this one on the Walnut Creek that actually set allocations. But most of these are in alluvial areas. In the heart of the Ogallala itself, you don't see any IGUCAs. So we've built a pretty extensive set of groundwater models, and I'm sort of using those to say, where are we going, and to sort of assess if we make changes, what do we do about it? So GMD4 in Northwest Kansas has been the most active until just recently in terms of using these tools. And this is just a depiction of one of the high priority areas I identified and what the model said. This is a depiction of the average change in water level in the aquifer. And so the aquifer is declining. This assessment was done in 2005, in decline. And the blue line says where we're going with no change. This purple line says, hey, if we shut off everything, shows the system recovering over time, and then varying amounts of cuts and how they would extend the life of that aquifer. So GMD4 went out and based on the modeling and developed high priority areas. These are the areas with their greatest decline, and sort of focused their discussions and their voluntary programs to reduce use in these high priority areas, these irregular areas. And the board discussed with each of these areas, hey, do you want to do something? And this one over here, in Sheridan County, my cursor, I lost it here. Oh, there it is. Okay. This one over here in Sheridan County wanted to reduce pumping 20% to extend the life of their aquifer. They did not want to use the priority system because the most junior water right was a feed yard that a lot of them were selling grain to. So they wanted to do something different. They weren't comfortable. The problem with IGUCAs is the chief engineer decides what to do based on the record. So they might want a 20% cut, and then through the IGUCA proceeding, the chief engineer might decide based on the hearing record, no, we need to do a 40% cut. So they didn't want that and didn't trust the system. So the manager of the district and the division went to the legislature to develop this new approach called LEMAs. And I'll talk about, and eventually Sheridan was the first LEMA and is working well. So LEMAs are like IGUCAs. They're only used where there's a demonstrated problem. It has the same tool set as IGUCAs, and in particular, the ability to allocate the resource to essentially cut everybody back in their use. It requires public hearings again, and a decision based on the record. But unlike IGUCAs, the hearing is basically on the question, should the GMD's plan be adopted, yes or no? So the GMD identifies the area, sets the goal for the area, and develops a plan for corrective controls, i.e. allocations to accomplish that goal. And then the hearings are held, should the GMD's plan be adopted or not. Wayne Bossert, the guy that spearheaded this, said, you're not guaranteed to get what you want, but you're guaranteed to not get what you don't want. So, so the Sheridan area, then, as soon as the law was passed, they initiated the proceedings, and I conducted the 2 hearings and allowed the plan to be adopted essentially as developed. And so this is a depiction of water use in the pre-LEMA period. So we have this method of correlating water use and climate factors. Irrigation is highly dependent, the quantity of irrigation is highly dependent upon the amount of precipitation, more in hot, dry seasons and less in wet, cool seasons. It's actually more affected by the heat and cool than the precip, but anyway. So we develop a relationship between these climate factors and use. Pre-LEMA is shown 2012, and post-LEMA is shown after 2012. The orange is the predicted value based on the climate conditions and that relationship that was developed. The blue is actually what actually occurred. And as you can see, The green line basically shows the average of the pre-Lima period and the average predicted value, the pre-Lima period and post-Lima period. It was a little bit wetter and cooler, and we would have predicted an average of, this is expressed in inches of applied water. The Lima basically allowed them to irrigate up to 11 inches of water per acre. But as you see, there's a much more dramatic reduction than would be predicted, which shows that the water users are changing their behavior. And that the Lima is in fact accomplishing its objective. And in fact, rather than a 20% reduction, their reductions were quite a bit more than that. Again, which is to their benefit in terms of their long-term supply. So based on the success of that, GMD4, the same GMD initiated a district-wide Lima in 2017. This is a depiction of the GMD in this irregular boundary. They looked at every single township, 6 miles, 36 square miles, and looked at the rate of the decline in the aquifer, and they developed allocations based on the rate of decline. The red ones are the most significant declines, therefore the most reduction required, and so forth. So basically, so this Lima was initiated in 2017. The first hearing found that it was needed. A second hearing was held in November. There's a group of what are called interveners that oppose the Lima. And I won't go through all the details of this slide, but basically, based on the hearing record, I was able to approve the Lima. I did send back the Lima with a number of changes that was required. I won't go into details there, but the GMD agreed with the changes I suggested based on the hearing record, and an order of designation was issued. Judicial review was filed in one of the counties of Northwest Kansas. And after a fairly extensive process, well over a year, the district court found that the Lima was in fact constitutional. And so that has been upheld. So this is just a depiction of the first 2 years of the Lima and how it's performed. This is now the district-wide. Again, so we've related climate factors and pumping in the pre-Lima period, 2017 and before. And so we've had 2 years of the Lima. Predicted values for irrigation would be in this range. We've actually seen a sharp reduction in pumping based on the Lima. So again, it seems to be working well. So one other tool, and I'll start to wrap up here. So Southwest Kansas has been pretty uninterested in Limas. But individual water users within Southwest Kansas have been interested in water conservation. And so we went to the legislature in 2015 to get this additional tool called water conservation areas. Unlike Limas that require an extensive hearing process and the GMD to initiate it, water conservation areas is essentially an agreement between a water user or a group of water users and the chief engineer that basically provide typically what happens, people want to use water, but maybe their better wells are not in the best locations. So they'll typically want some flexibility, sort of multi-year flexibility, as well as some ability to move the water between their water rights. And so WCAs is an opportunity for them to get some of the flexibilities, which often are part of Limas, into their suite of water rights, as long as they'll use that flexibility to, in fact, reduce use. So no hearings, a streamlined process. No, it doesn't make permanent changes in their water rights. So we've been working with this tool, and we've got 27 water conservation areas in different parts of Western Kansas. We also have a large one in Wichita County I'll talk about here in a minute if I have a chance. that has 26 individual consent agreements over that county. So this is not going to save the entire Ogallala, but it is having a significant effect in some local areas and to local producers. Wichita County is a highly depleted county in that GMD number 1. They've got 23 feet of average saturated thickness. So not much water, but they have some very high animal agriculture, feedlots and dairies moving in, and they want to preserve their water. So they've got 20% of their counties to of the water rights of their counties to voluntarily enroll in this WCA. That starts with a 29% reduction and ramps up to 50% over the coming years. It's a pretty big deal out there. There's also another WCA area that a large number of water users have enrolled in to reduce use northwest of Garden City. So again, so again, the value of these water conservation areas, there's water savings in that area, flexibilities. It's demonstrating to other people that they can make water profitably with savings. And it actually often leads to LEMA discussions. And so again, this Wichita County area, this is within that highly dewatered area of western Kansas. This is Wichita County where that WCA, that water conservation area, was formed. 20% of the people enrolled, but the water users wanted everybody in. So they went to their GMD and lobbied very hard to have the GMD to develop a LEMA. And they basically wanted, so this is a depiction of pumping rates. Their pumping rates are going down as the water level goes down. They're actually extending the pumping season by pumping more days. Let's see here. So in 2018, the WCA steering committee went to the LEMA and went to the board, GMD board, and wanted a LEMA. They actually wanted the board to propose the WCA provisions as a LEMA. After significant discussions, the board elected instead to basically propose a little, instead of this 29% ramping up to 50%, let's just start with everybody reduced to 25%. So it's been through the first hearing successfully, and the second hearing is in November 20th to determine if it should be adopted. I'm pretty optimistic it will be. And I'm actually now one of my major clients. I've been helping them with the hearing preparations, and now they're actually going back to their other counties and start. I'm working with them to look at the water use records and the water level declines, and trying to determine proposed corrective controls for LEMAs in these other counties. It's a challenge. They have a lot of water poor areas. The blue areas are areas of greater saturated thickness. There's this area here is called the Scott City Trough, where the bedrock is deeper, and so the aquifer is deeper. We also have a very productive portion in Wallace County, 2 of them here. So we got to figure out what controls will sort of work and how to tailor them to the very diverse groundwater climates in this GMD. So, okay, I'm going to wrap it up here. Ogallala next steps. These tools definitely represent progress in Sheridan County, Wichita County, that area northwest of the GMD and Garden City. But obviously declines persist. Individual users can take action to extend the life of their supply, because groundwater doesn't move very fast. So the benefits of reductions often stay with that user, but joint action is really certainly the best hope for extending the life of that aquifer. All right, I'm done. Any other questions here?